Hello and welcome to another Tag1 TeamTalk episode, the podcast and blog of Tag1 Consulting. Today we're going to be talking with and walking through some code examples with Fabian Franz, the VP of Software Engineering at Tag1. And we're going to be talking about how to reduce the complexity of your applications by using Preact and HTM. I'm Michael Miners, the Managing Director of Tag1 Consulting, and today's talk is broken up into two parts. This is part two, where Fabian's going to really dive into Preact HTM and give us some code examples using the Drupal 9 Umami default install. If you haven't already seen it, please check out part one, which is a really awesome background into why applications have gotten so complex, the reasons for it, the benefits, but also why you don't always need it. So Fabian, the background was great. I'm eager to jump into some examples, but before we do that, what is Preact? What does it have to do with React? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. Just real quick for those that not have watched part one. The idea was essentially that modern JavaScript, and I've read that on Twitter, it's not from me, you need a PhD with all the tools and everything to set it up, etc. And Drupal developers, at least there was a time when Drupal developers were very productive using jQuery. Unfortunately, jQuery has become very old. It's not obsolete yet, it's still here in Drupal, and we'll even be using a little part of it. But for this scenario, imagine the typical jQuery developer that has been using Drupal for a while, that doesn't need too large of complexity in that doesn't want to do much of JavaScript development, but that essentially just wants to build a little bit like decoupled headless things sprinkled in the Drupal side already existing. So today we'll be creating a nice progress bar using Tailwind. The setup is Umami, but with the Tailwind Umami on top of it. And Tailwind Umami is essentially like a little theme that subthemes Umami, which I'm using to demo Tailwind, and we'll be make use of the styles this provides. So Step Umami is actually on my GitHub. We'll be sharing the links later, and you can look at, and I'll be also committing the Preact things to it just because we can. So let's go to some screen sharing the desktop, and here we go. So what you can see here is our little demo. We have recipes, and here we have a little block, and we can make random progress. But first, Michael, you asked, what is Preact? So Preact is a fast 3 kilobit alternative to React with the same modern API. So React has proven itself by now. It's great. It's still one of the best frameworks out there. Yes, there's things like Vue.js, there's other parts, but there's also React and this great ecosystem. But React, unfortunately, is pretty big. It's not as fast as it could be. And React also brings in a lot and usually needs JSX and all this tooling. But Preact essentially is a really fast 3 kilobit alternative. And the main difference is there's a compat library if you want to use traditional React things, and most things just work, so you can use any component that's written in React and just use it here with Preact if you use a compat package. But the main difference is while React is re-implementing all the events, like it has a synthetic event model, Preact is just using the events that the browser supports. That's why it can be much smaller. So it's very close to the DOM, it's small size, big performance, portable, embeddable, and you're instantly productive. And so here's our standard to-dos list thing. Probably have seen that already. This is the JSX form of syntax that we talked about. That means you can just write HTML in your JavaScript. And we'll be doing something pretty similar, but use a little trick. Michael?
So you mentioned Preact and HTM. What's the HTM component?
The HTM is the magic sauce that makes it all build-less. HTM essentially allows us to use this very, very similar syntax to how the Preact was, but we have this HTML, and this is a template literal. So this looks very, very similar to the to-dos that we have seen here, but instead of escaping just with a bracket and using this kind of syntax, we're using this $props syntax. We're coming to that in a little bit more. This is standard JavaScript. every JavaScript can do this. It's a so-called template, text template, literal, or tag templates. And essentially you are having a string, this just string, and you can escape it whenever you want by using this $ and bracket up. So, and that way it looks like JSX, but it's not JSX. And the nice thing is you can use this without any tooling. You can compile it using Babel plugin HTM. So if you want to use tooling, you can still compile it. That's what I said. You can optimize it for production, but you don't need to. There's no transpiler necessary, and it has lots of nice features in that. There's even lit HTML, Visual Studio Code extension, and the Vim J6 Pretty plugin, so that looks all well. And the nicest thing is, similar to how you imported jQuery originally, you just have a standalone module which has everything you need. And that's essentially what we did here. So I download the HTM Preact standalone module.js. We don't need the hooks, so this one, yeah. And the standalone module.js, that is the one that you had seen here for unpackaged.com. So just download that into your code base, and then we set it up via our libraries.json. So I have my theme here, libraries YML, and here I have Tailwind, Alpine, we come to that later. And here we load our Preact.js as a module. It should be, maybe Drupal 9 supports a different way to do that. In Drupal 7, you need to use this kind of trick of type external, attributes, type module, cross-origin, use credentials. Because for this import syntax to work, you need to be within a so-called JavaScript module. And JavaScript modules are something new that browsers support by now. And they allow to essentially load JavaScript on the fly and just use what you want from it. So this is how we set it all up. And then we look in our Preact.js, and here we import it. And we import this HTML and render function from the standalone module.js. This is how you set it up. This is like a little complex, but let's look at the widget itself. So this is the standard React widget. Again, we import the standalone module. We have our button here for making random progress. And then we have our little HTML here. And you can see here again, we have progress 0, something different, or we have our percentage here. Here we have our button component embedded. And I don't have this nice plugin for VAM I'm using here, so this really looks just like a string to me, which is then combined again with these template literals, which are then I can put my logic in there. But this is essentially how you write React with Tailwind, so it looks a little bit nicer, because else this progress bar would just be a number, and that might have been not as exciting. Michael, do you have any questions so far?
We're going from no compilers to no IDEs here today. You mentioned this module approach. Does that, I assume, work with mobile devices as well? This concept of only pulling in the bits that you need?
It works everywhere so far at the, wrong side. It works everywhere. So if you look at the scripts that are input, we should be able to see it. It's probably down. Yeah, there we go. So the type module is a very special way of ensuring you can, here we go. This is how the script tag essentially looks if you do it. And this type module is really saying to the browser that this is its own context, its own execution context where this is executed. So it has nothing to do with the other things. But this is how you get into this state where you are able to then import one thing from another and cross-reference things. So how did we get this React widget here on the page? So it's very simple. What I did is I added a little text format, raw HTML, put code mirror in, and then I'm writing my HTML code here. Here's my Tailwind classes, like this would be centered and full width with a little bit of bottom margin. And then I put just here this Preact widget with widget equals test. Right now I only have one widget, but it's very simple. And I could have another widget here. And once I save that and we reload, you see there's one quick moment for it loading. And then I see two progress bars. and they also have their independent states because they're independent. And that's how you essentially do it. So this is my kind of proposal. This is very, very similar to how real web components work. This could also be using real web components, but they have their own life cycles and other things that are nice, but not necessarily needed.
In my mind there, because you've done so many great talks on web components, and when I saw you do that, I was like, oh my gosh, how isn't or why isn't this web component? So this is this could be done as a web component as well. Something I could just plug in via layout builder, as an end user.
For sure. No, the master plan is a little bit different. You have to distinguish here, and that's something you don't know, obviously, is there's web components, which is a specification of defining custom HTML elements, which are then used, and it could have done that for this, but it didn't. And there is components, which is different from the web component specification we are talking about. And those components are essentially for that I could place just a component here with this custom block via layout builder or whatever. And that's for sure. That's the master plan, essentially, that we have our component library, which we still have installed here. And then instead of just putting my Twig template, I can put in a special Twig template, put in my Preact component, click on add component, or however that will work. Maybe even upload the JavaScript for the widget right in the browser, and boom, I have my component here. So yeah.
Either way, this is something that I think site builders could, if these components already exist, whether it's a component, a web component, this is really powerful. Like, this makes it easy for me to jump in there and add this kind of thing wherever I need it, whatever page. So it doesn't just make life easier for developers. I think it makes life easier for site builders and anybody who's working with the site. This is really powerful.
For sure. And I mean, that's the whole point of components, to create reusable components, create reusable design elements with embedded interactivity. But it doesn't need to be React. So for example, if I don't have interactivity like I have here, then I don't necessarily need React for that. I mean, this simple example, we could have also done it with Alpine, which we'll talk a bit again in another talk. But I want to quickly also show how we are essentially, for those jQuery developers, attaching this. So this is a standard Drupal attach function. Very, very standard. The difference is that we are having this import statements here, which are the JavaScript modules part. And then essentially we're searching for all Preact widgets. And here we use a little bit of jQuery. For each Preact widget, we are finding them all. Then we render the widget to a virtual DOM with the progress being random at part, so I can even pass properties in here. But I could not only pass properties. So for example, this function not only takes context, but it also takes settings. So if I wanted to, I could say config equals and then settings dot preact dot test dot configuration. And then, for example, I could use Drupal settings output to output the configuration for my Preact widget from a blog, from wherever I want, even generated from the UI. Or what I could be doing is I could be doing a request here to JSON API and JSON API resource, like set up a view, create me some resources, and then I could get some data in and sprinkle some interactivity using JSON API, which usually only used for decoupled Drupal sites, to sprinkle it in. That's a hybrid approach, essentially. Like, for example, you have a logged in users, no one cares about SEO. So why not? And you have a complex React widget already built like that, and it works like that. So that's how you can do those things. So let's undo that real quick, because I want to show, for example, but if I now, and that's the whole point, if I change progress to 0, for example, at the beginning, it's at 0. So I just reload my browser and it's there. Now, those using the tooling will say, hey, I don't even need to reload my browser. I directly see it's 0. And that's a hot module reloading. And you can still use that. But my point is, you don't need to. There's nothing stopping you for using this reloading, etc. like that. So, and essentially, so we render our test widget, and then we call the render function and render it to wherever our widget is. And that's kind of all the boilerplate you need. And I wrote that in about an hour before the demo today to just set it all up. So it's really simple. And in my opinion, Preact and HTM should replace jQuery in Drupal 10 or something like that, because I think Drupal should ship with a framework and be opinionated about something, like it was opinionated about jQuery, but I don't think it should force people to do all this build steps, etc., but really be as simple to use as always. Put in a JS file, attach it, and boom, you have Preact up and running and everything like that.
A time and a place for complexity, but this makes things really simple for developers and amazing for site builders, right? It really empowers a lot of other people in the organization, and that's something that you really need to think about when you're designing and building your application is, you know, who's going to be using it, how is it going to be built out. So this is really win-win.
Yeah, you essentially don't really need to think about, yes, there's lots of tooling that makes development work nicer. I'm the first to tell that essentially, but the point is essentially, if you're used to like sprinkle a little bit of jQuery, then you can sprinkle a little bit of Preact HTM now.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned Alpine. You know, you also touched on two things that hopefully we can come back and talk more about how you can use those tools in a very similar way for this. Fabian, the demo was awesome. Thank you. And please, for everyone who tuned in, make sure to check out part 1, the intro and background. If you like this talk, please remember to upvote, subscribe, and share it out. You can check out our past talks at tag1.com/TTT. That's 3 T's for Tag1 Team Talks. As always, we'd love your feedback and topic suggestions. You can write to us at ttt@tag1.com. And a big thank you, Fabian, for putting together this demo and walking us through it, and to everyone who tuned in and joined us today. Take care.